It was the autumn after I had the typhoid. I'd been 3 months in hospital, and when I came out I looked so weak and tottery that the 2 or 3 ladies I applied to were afraid to engage me. Most of my money was gone, and after I'd boarded for 2 months, hanging about the employment agencies and answering any advertisement that looked any way respectable, I pretty nearly lost heart, for fretting hadn't made me fatter, and I didn't see why my luck should ever turn. It did, though, or I thought so at the time. A Mrs. Wharton, a friend of the lady that first brought me out to the States, met me one day and stopped to speak to me. She was one that had always a friendly way with her. She asked me what ailed me to look so white, and when I told her, "Why, Hartley," says she, "I believe I've got the very place for you. Come in tomorrow and we'll talk about it." The next day, when I called, she told me the lady she'd in mind was a niece of hers, a Mrs. Brympton, a youngish lady, but something of an invalid, who lived all the year round at her country place on the Hudson, owing to not being able to stand the fatigue of town life. "Now, Hartley," Mrs. Wharton said, in that cheery way that always made me feel things must be going to take a turn for the better, "now understand me, it's not a cheerful place I'm sending you to. The house is big and gloomy, my niece is nervous, vapourish, her husband, well, he's generally away, and the 2 children are dead. A year ago I would as soon have thought of shutting a rosy active girl like you into a vault. But you're not particularly brisk yourself just now, are you? And a quiet place, with country air and wholesome food and early hours, ought to be the very thing for you. Don't mistake me," she added, for I suppose I looked a trifle downcast. "You may find it dull, but you won't be unhappy. My niece is an angel. Her former maid, who died last spring, had been with her 20 years, and worshipped the ground she walked on. She's a kind mistress to all, and where the mistress is kind, as you know, the servants are generally good-humoured, so you'll probably get on well enough with the rest of the household, and you're the very woman I want for my niece, quiet, well-mannered, and educated above your station. You read aloud well, I think. That's a good thing. My niece likes to be read to. She wants a maid that can be something of a companion. Her last was, and I can't say how she misses her. It's a lonely life. Well, have you decided?" "Why, ma'am," I said, "I'm not afraid of solitude." "Well, then go. My niece will take you on my recommendation. I'll telegraph her at once, and you can take the afternoon train. She has no one to wait on her at present, and I don't want you to lose any time." I was ready enough to start, yet something in me hung back, and to gain time I asked, "And the gentleman, ma'am?" "The gentleman's almost always away, I tell you," said Mrs. Wharton, quick-like, "and when he's there," says she suddenly, "you've only got to keep out of his way." I took the afternoon train and got out at D station at about 4 o'clock. A groom in a dog-cart was waiting, and we drove off at a smart pace. It was a dull October day, with rain hanging close overhead, and by the time we turned into the Brympton Place woods, the daylight was almost gone. The drive wound through the woods for a mile or 2, and came out on a gravel court shut in with thickets of tall black-looking shrubs. There were no lights in the windows, and the house did look a bit gloomy. I had asked no questions of the groom, for I never was one to get my notions of new masters from their other servants. I prefer to wait and see for myself. But I could tell by the look of everything that I had got into the right kind of house, and that things were done handsomely. A pleasant-faced cook met me at the back door, and called the housemaid to show me up to my room. "You'll see madam later," she said. "Mrs. Brympton has a visitor." I hadn't fancied Mrs. Brympton was a lady to have many visitors, and somehow the words cheered me. I followed the housemaid upstairs, and saw, through a door on the upper landing, that the main part of the house seemed well furnished, with dark panelling and a number of old portraits. Another flight of stairs led me up to the servants' wing. It was almost dark now, and the housemaid excused herself for not having brought a light. "But there's matches in your room," she said, "and if you go careful, you'll be all right. Mind the step at the end of the passage. Your room is just beyond." I looked ahead as she spoke, and halfway down the passage I saw a woman standing. She drew back into a doorway as we passed, and the housemaid didn't appear to notice her. She was a thin woman with a white face, and a darkish stuff gown and apron. I took her for the housekeeper, and thought it odd that she didn't speak, but just gave me a long look as she went by. My room opened into a square hall at the end of the passage. Facing my door was another, which stood open. The housemaid exclaimed when she saw it. "There, Mrs. Blinder's left that door open again," said she, closing it. "Is Mrs. Blinder the housekeeper?" There's no housekeeper. Mrs. Blinder's the cook." "And is that her room?" "Laws, no," said the housemaid, cross-like. "That's nobody's room. It's empty, I mean, and the door hadn't ought to be open. Mrs. Brimpton wants it kept locked." She opened my door and led me into a neat room, nicely furnished, with a picture or two on the walls. And having lit a candle, she took leave, telling me that the servants' hall tea was at 6, and that Mrs. Brimpton would see me afterward. I found them a pleasant-spoken set in the servants' hall, and by what they let fall I gathered that, as Mrs. Railton had said, Mrs. Brimpton was the kindest of ladies. But I didn't take much notice of their talk, for I was watching to see the pale woman in the dark gown come in. She didn't show herself, however, and I wondered if she ate apart. But if she wasn't the housekeeper, why should she? Suddenly it struck me that she might be a trained nurse, and in that case her meals would, of course, be served in her room. If Mrs. Brimpton was an invalid, it was likely enough she had a nurse. The idea annoyed me, I own, for they're not always the easiest to get on with, and if I'd known, I shouldn't have taken the place. But there I was, and there was no use pulling a long face over it, and not being one to ask questions, I waited to see what would turn up. When tea was over, the housemaid said to the footman, "Has Mr. Ranford gone?" And when he said yes, she told me to come up with her to Mrs. Brimpton. Mrs. Brimpton was lying down in her bedroom. Her lounge stood near the fire, and beside it was a shaded lamp. She was a delicate-looking lady, but when she smiled I felt there was nothing I wouldn't do for her. She spoke very pleasantly, in a low voice, asking me my name and age and so on, and if I had everything I wanted, and if I wasn't afraid of feeling lonely in the country. "Not with you I wouldn't be, madam," I said, and the words surprised me when I'd spoken them, for I am not an impulsive person, but it was just as if I'd thought aloud. She seemed pleased at that, and said she hoped I'd continue in the same mind. Then she gave me a few directions about her toilet, and said Agnes the housemaid would show me next morning where things were kept. "I am tired tonight, and shall dine upstairs," she said. "Agnes will bring me my tray, and you may have time to unpack and settle yourself, and later you may come and undress me." "Very well, ma'am," I said. "You'll ring, I suppose?" I thought she looked odd. "No, Agnes will fetch you," said she quickly, and took up her book again. Well, that was certainly strange, a lady's maid having to be fetched by the housemaid whenever her lady wanted her. I wondered if there were no bells in the house, but the next day I satisfied myself that there was one in every room, and a special one ringing from my mistress's room to mine, and after that it did strike me as queer that, whenever Mrs. Brimpton wanted anything, she rang for Agnes, who had to walk the whole length of the servants' wing to call me. But that wasn't the only queer thing in the house. The very next day I found out that Mrs. Brimpton had no nurse, and then I asked Agnes about the woman I had seen in the passage the afternoon before. Agnes said she had seen no one, and I saw that she thought I was dreaming. To be sure, it was dusk when we went down the passage, and she had excused herself for not bringing a light, but I had seen the woman plain enough to know her again if we should meet. I decided that she must have been a friend of the cook's, or of one of the other women servants. Perhaps she had come down from town for a night's visit, and the servants wanted it kept secret. Some ladies are very stiff about having their servants' friends in the house overnight. At any rate, I made up my mind to ask no more questions. In a day or two, another odd thing happened. I was chatting one afternoon with Mrs. Blinder, who was a friendly disposed woman, and had been longer in the house than the other servants, and she asked me if I was quite comfortable and had everything I needed. I said I had no fault to find with my place or with my mistress, but I thought it odd that in so large a house there was no sewing room for the lady's maid. "Why," said she, "there is one. The room you're in is the old sewing room." "Oh," said I, "and where did the other lady's maid sleep?" At that she grew confused, and said hurriedly that the servants' rooms had all been changed about last year, and she didn't rightly remember. That struck me as peculiar, but I went on as if I hadn't noticed. "Well, there's a vacant room opposite mine, and I mean to ask Mrs. Brimpton if I mayn't use that as a sewing room." To my astonishment, Mrs. Blinder went white, and gave my hand a kind of squeeze. "Don't do that, my dear," she said, trembling like. "To tell you the truth, that was Emma Saxon's room, and my mistress has kept it closed ever since her death." "And who was Emma Saxon?" Mrs. Brumpton's former maid. The one that was with her so many years, said I, remembering what Mrs. Wharton had told me. Mrs. Blinder nodded. What sort of woman was she? No better walked the earth, said Mrs. Blinder. My mistress loved her like a sister. But I mean, what did she look like? Mrs. Blinder got up and gave me a kind of angry stare. I'm no great hand at describing, she said, and I believe my pastry's rising. And she walked off into the kitchen and shut the door after her.